Systems Manual for Longevity from Three Souls: Innovation, Survival, and a Concave Upward Life Trajectory Part 1 No. 1638, the 12th of May 2026, Gerald C. EclaireMD Foundation. Category: Self-Reflection. Preface: In the past few months, I have been deeply reflecting on my entire life trajectory, starting from my mid-days, Professor Norman Jones, my entrepreneurial struggles, later success, multiple diseases, and my recent stroke recovery. Through this long self-reflection process, I finally began to understand the deeper linkage between knowledge and life purpose. Perhaps this is partly a sign that I am getting old. However, on the other hand, I also feel grateful that I am still alive and mentally capable of writing these experiences down. At least I may still have something useful to share with younger generations regarding their future life trajectories, decision-making, and the long-term direction of their own lives. Now, in 2026 at age 79, the fog of my life journey has finally become much clearer to me. After looking back across my years at MIT, Silicon Valley, artificial intelligence development, 7 failed entrepreneurial attempts, the eventual business success of my semiconductor chip venture, 8 severe health collapses, recent stroke recovery, and 17 years of non-stop medical self-study and research, I can finally see the deeper common thread connecting almost every major stage of my adult and senior life. This writing of self-realization did not come from ego or self-congratulation. Instead, it emerged quietly through decades of learning, suffering, discipline, observation, and long-term reflection. Over time, I gradually realized that the same underlying systems philosophy kept reappearing across mathematics, physics, engineering, AI, medicine, neuroscience, and even human life trajectories. In many ways, my entire life gradually became a large systems dynamics experiment. In this article, I provide a rough comparison among Steve Jobs, Polarities, and myself from a broader life trajectory perspective. Professor Norman Jones and the simplicity of life purpose. One of the deepest influences in my life came from my MIT advisor, Professor Norman Jones. In 1973 on the MIT campus, he told me that his only real interests in life were teaching and researching. He was never strongly motivated by fame, power, or money. Eventually, he even left the prestige of MIT and returned to his hometown of Liverpool, UK, because he valued family stability and a simpler life structure. At the time, I did not fully understand the depth of what he meant. Now, at age 79, I finally understand much more clearly. Professor Jones was not merely describing a career preference. He was describing a systems philosophy for life itself: reduce unnecessary noise, maintain internal stability, continue learning, and apply knowledge continuously over long periods of time. I now realize that my own life gradually evolved in a very similar direction. My deepest interest has never been fame, power, or wealth themselves. My deepest interest has always been knowledge, learning, and application to create useful products for worldwide users. Even my recent 17 years of studying and researching medicine were initially aimed at saving my own life first, and later helping other patients become healthier and live longer lives. During different stages of my life, the applications changed, starting from conventional engineering, AI-based engineering software products, semiconductor chips, business systems, and later biomedical research, but the underlying operating principle remained surprisingly consistent: learn deeply, understand systems clearly, and then apply learned knowledge usefully. The artist and the engineer. I first met Steve Jobs during the late 1970s and early 1980s in Palo Alto, California, before the name Silicon Valley had even become widely established. At that time, he was developing the Apple II desktop computer, while I was working on one of the world's first portable PCs, the Pied Piper, a briefcase-sized computer weighing approximately 12 pounds. During that era, many people still viewed portable computing as impractical because the industry remained psychologically attached to desks and fixed workstations. However, my engineering instinct told me that human civilization would eventually move toward mobility, decentralization, and distributed intelligence. This discussion is not intended to compare Steve Jobs and myself. Competitively, both of us contributed to the same society in different ways. However, there is value in examining how two highly driven innovators, both reaching major life crossroads around age 55 to 56, responded differently to technology, mortality, and human systems. Steve Jobs was fundamentally an artist-philosopher operating inside the technology industry. His Extraordinary talent came from understanding emotional resonance between humans and machines. He transformed computers from cold technical devices into emotional companions. I came from a very different intellectual direction. My training at MIT was deeply rooted in mathematics, physics, engineering mechanics, AI, dynamic systems, optimization, and viscoplastic structural analysis. My instinct was never focused mainly on artistic design or emotional elegance. Instead, I became obsessed with structure, mobility, accuracy, efficiency, scalability, interaction, and long-term system trajectories. In short, Steve Jobs was fundamentally an artist and philosopher, while I have always been more of a scientist and engineer. Looking backward now, my early intuition about portable computing was directionally aligned with what later became laptops, wireless computing, smartphones, cloud systems, wearable devices, and AI-assisted mobile ecosystems. Steve Jobs perfected the emotional beauty of personal computing. I focused more on the future geometry and trajectory of technological movement itself. Open systems and biomedical systems. Another major difference between Steve Jobs and myself involved systems thinking. Jobs preferred tightly integrated and highly controlled ecosystems. Apple products became elegant partly because every component was centrally managed. My own engineering philosophy evolved differently, coming from AI, engineering simulation, semiconductor automation, and later biomedical research. I gradually became convinced that most real-world systems are nonlinear, adaptive, and continuously interacting open systems. This became even clearer during my medical research years. The human body is not an isolated machine assembled from independent parts. It is an open biomedical system involving glucose flow, vascular mechanics, neural signaling, hormonal interaction, inflammation, sleep recovery, emotional disturbance, environmental influence, lifestyle habits, and long-term trajectory accumulation. Engineering taught me that system behavior is often determined not by isolated variables themselves, but by dynamic interaction among multiple variables over time. That same principle applies equally to AI systems, business corporations, geopolitical systems, evolutionary biology, and biomedical systems. The turning point of life around age 5556. One of the most dramatic parallels between Steve Jobs and myself may be that both of us encountered major mortality crises around age 55 to 56. For Steve Jobs, pancreatic cancer became the defining medical battle of his later life. For me, decades of extreme workload, stress, sleep deprivation, legal battles, and executive pressure gradually produced severe obesity, diabetes complications, kidney damage, neuropathy, retinopathy, multiple heart attacks, and eventually stroke. However, the critical difference was not the disease itself. The critical difference was their response framework. Steve Jobs approached illness partly through intuition, spirituality, dietary experimentation, and instinct-driven medicine, including searching for alternative miracle-type treatments in Mexico. I understand why he did this because the same artistic intuition had guided much of his earlier success. But biology does not negotiate with intuition alone. The human body still obeys physics, chemistry, physiology, and pathology. My science background and engineering instinct forced me toward a very practical and different response. I began treating my deteriorating body almost like a failing nonlinear structure requiring continuous monitoring, signal analysis, trajectory prediction, stress-strain interpretation, feedback control loops, root cause identification, and long-term stabilization. At one point, I realized something deeply painful. If I continued focusing mainly on business expansion, industry status, and corporate warfare, I would definitely die before around age 60. That realization forced one of the hardest decisions of my life. I stepped away from direct business leadership and sold my company to another major player in the same industry. Emotionally, it felt like giving away my own child. Structurally, from silicon to neuroscience, most people originally knew me from the semiconductor and high-tech industry. Very few expected me to move into medical research because I had never formally worked as a biomedical researcher earlier in life. However, after 2010, my intellectual trajectory shifted almost completely. I redirected the same systems thinking, methodology, and relentless energy that I once applied to engineering structures, I-systems, semiconductor automation, optimization, and business systems, particularly semiconductor chips composed of transistors and electrical wiring pathways for the human body itself. From the heart, kidneys, and nerves to the brain, including neurons and neural pathways. In many ways, semiconductor chips and the human brain both function as complex signal processing systems, composed of interconnected switching elements, transistors and chips and neurons. In the brain, together with communication pathways formed by electrical wiring and neural pathways, over the following 17 years, from 2010 to 2026, I built a massive longitudinal biomedical and lifestyle database from my own body, eventually accumulating more than 4 million data points across glucose, blood pressure, body weight, visceral fat, sleep, stress, food, exercise, cardiovascular and renal dynamics, stroke risk, cognitive recovery, and aging trajectories. Meanwhile, I wrote more than 1,638 medical research papers, not because I wanted fame or academic prestige, but because I was trying to solve a survival problem while also keeping a longitudinal journey. Record of my battles against chronic metabolic conditions, mortality diseases, and the aging process. Over time, this gradually evolved into something much larger than personal survival. A humanitarian mission to help ordinary patients better understand their own body through simple science, engineering logic, and 17-year longitudinal trajectory observation. I also decided to bypass traditional medical journals and conferences. Instead, I chose to communicate directly with patients through mass communication platforms such as YouTube. In many ways, I simply transferred my engineering and entrepreneurial career into a different platform. The underlying philosophy never fundamentally changed, only the medium changed from silicon chips to human pathophysiology. The most important conclusion from my self-reflection is that, through my faith, confidence, and trust in science, especially mathematics, physics, engineering, and medicine, I was able to save my own life with a critical pivot point around age 55. This is part 1.